Thank you, Minister. Hi, everybody. My name is Peter Van Craig, and I am the moderator for today's lunch session, and I'm going to speak for a few minutes and set up the panel. So please go ahead and continue eating, and we will take it from there. I want to begin today, first of all, just by saying how great it is to be in India and at the Raisina Dialogue. I had talked to Samir back in 2012, where he told me that he was planning on building this out. It's my first time here, and it's I don't think Samir is in the room, but I just want to congratulate everybody from ORF for putting on such an incredible couple of days, and really it's a very important meeting. I'm proud to be in India. I have not been in India since 2004. I was just telling the minister that my family lived in India when I was very young. I don't have memories of that time. My sisters do, however. Both of my parents were journalists. And I was just telling the minister my father had the privilege of being kicked out of India by Indira Gandhi in 1970. My father spent a lifetime writing this book, and I had the chance to read it again on the flight over, The Greater Game, India's Race with Destiny in China, published in 2003. And I think it's pertinent still today, where we really will be talking about India's race with China. I'm going to now introduce our panelists. Panelists, please feel free to continue eating, unless I'm talking specifically about you. We have Mrs. Theresa Fallon. Mrs. Fallon has over 20 years' experience as an analyst and writer on global energy and geopolitics. She is Irish-American, lives and is based in Brussels, where she is the founder of the Center for Russia-Europe-Asia Studies. Mrs. Fallon's current research focus is on EU-Asia relations, China-Russia relations, maritime security, global governance, and China's Belt and Road Initiative. Great to have you here, Mrs. Fallon. To General Petraeus's left, we have Mr. Rexon Yu. Mr. Yu, also American, has served 3 United States presidents at the highest level of government since entering public service in 1994. He worked in President Obama's National Security Council, working on non-proliferation, Iran, and North Korea. Later, also in the Obama administration, Mr. Yu served as Chief of Staff to the United States Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel, where he helped lead and manage the Department of Defense, the world's largest organization with nearly 3 million personnel and a budget of $500 billion. Now, Mr. Yu is a partner at the Washington, D.C.-based Asia Group, where he offers companies strategic and political insight across the Indo-Pacific region. Mr. Yu, welcome. We have on my left General David Petraeus. General Petraeus, also American, served 37 years in the United States Army, culminating his career with 6 consecutive commands, 5 of which were in combat, including command of coalition forces during the surge in Iraq, command of U.S. Central Command, and command of coalition forces in Afghanistan. Following his service in the military, General Petraeus served as director of the CIA during a period of significant achievements in the global war on terror. General Petraeus graduated with distinction from the U.S. Military Academy and earned his Ph.D. at Princeton, and subsequently taught economics and international relations at the U.S. Military Academy. General Petraeus has received numerous awards, including 4 Defense Distinguished Medals, the Bronze Star Medal for Valor, the Combat Action Badge, and has been decorated by 13 foreign countries. One of my heroes and mentors, Senator John McCain, regularly referred to General Petraeus as the greatest American military mind since the American Revolution. General Petraeus joined New York City-based KKR, one of the world's largest private equity firms, in 2013, and is chairman of the KKR Global Institute, which supports KKR's investment committees, portfolio companies, and limited partners with analysis of geopolitical and macroeconomic trends, as well as environmental, social, and governance issues. General Petraeus, it's a privilege.
Thank you.
I was to introduce Prime Minister Stephen Harper. Prime Minister Stephen Harper is unable to be with us today. He is still, after being Prime Minister for 10 years in Canada, in high demand. I will say I have a whole paragraph committed to Prime Minister Harper, but what I will say at this juncture is that under Mr. Harper's leadership, Canada dramatically deepened its relationship with India. I will also say that I was very proud to serve in Prime Minister Harper's government at the very beginning of his premiership in 2006 and 2007 as Director of Policy for Canada's Minister of Foreign Affairs. Beside Rexon Yu is Shuv Majumdar. Shuv worked in Prime Minister Harper's government, also at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs between 2011 and 2015, and is a fellow at the Macdonald Cartier Institute. And we're glad to have you here. Immediately on my right, we have with us the Honorable Shri Hardeep Singh Puri, India's Minister of Housing and Urban Affairs. The minister joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1974, and during a career spanning 39 years served in senior position at the Ministries of External Affairs and Defense, and held ambassadorial level posts in the UK, Brazil, and served as permanent representative of India to the United Nations, both in Geneva and New York. He had earlier served in India's missions in Tokyo and Colombo. The minister has extensive experience in multilateral diplomacy. He served on 3 occasions as a member of India's delegation to the GATT, United Nations in Geneva, including as ambassador and permanent representative from 2002 to 2005. He has had a long association with and specialization in trade policy-related matters and served on several dispute settlement panels of the GATT and WTO. He was president of the United Nations Security Council in August 2011 and November 2012, and chairman of the United Nations Security Council Counterterrorism Committee in 2011-2012. The minister retired from the Indian Foreign Service in 2013 and joined the International Peace Institute in New York. The minister has delivered numerous lectures at international fora and also published a large number of articles and papers, including a public lecture on India and the Western Liberal Democratic Order at the Nehru Memorial Museum in January 2017. He also authored India's Trade Policy Dilemma and the Role of Domestic Reform, published by Carnegie India in February 2017, and the minister is the author of Perilous Interventions, the Security Council, and the Politics of Chaos, which was published by HarperCollins in 2016. The minister has kindly offered me his copy of a brand new book, Delusional Politics, that I think he'll have the opportunity to talk about on this panel. Minister, welcome. The minister became minister in September 2017. Thank you so much, Minister. I want to say a couple of words about the organization that I lead. Halifax International Security Forum's mission is the basis for this panel, to strengthen strategic cooperation among the world's democracies. We are a Washington, D.C. based organization that began with strong support from Prime Minister Harper's government and early support from Senator John McCain, who led an American congressional delegation to Halifax every year until his passing. We will miss Senator McCain's leadership very much. Now, 10 years since we began, our forum that convenes every November in Halifax, Canada, brings together 300 ministers, senior military officers, and writers and thinkers from the world's democracies to address our common challenge. Where some have said that demography is destiny, at Halifax we say that democracy is destiny. Which brings us now to this panel, appropriately hosted here in India, where both demography and democracy are on its side. There have been a lot of conversations here at Raisins Dialogue over the last 2 days about the problems democracies are facing today. Of course, that is an important subject, and we will touch upon it. But for the purpose of this panel, let us operate under the assumption that Prime Minister Harper is correct when he wrote in his 2018 book, Right Here, Right Now, that despite today's bad press, democracies and democracy are and will continue to be the best form of government. As a minister in India's democracy, I turn to you first. Are you satisfied with how global democracies, countries that say over and over again how important our shared values are you satisfied that global democracies cooperate enough with one another on each other's fundamental concerns?
May I?
Please.
Thank you, Peter. Let me start by saying upfront that it's been a while since I've been able to participate in a discussion like this. I spent 42 years in the world of diplomacy, security policy, but for the last 16, 17 months, I've been narrowly confined to the urban space. So thank you for including me in this discussion. And let me address some of the points you make. Insofar as India is concerned, and this is, I speak in my personal capacity, naturally because my portfolio in the Council of Ministers is Housing and Urban Affairs, so I would not want anything I say, even off the record, to be construed as trying to define the turf insofar as foreign and security policy is concerned. So with that clarification up front, let me say that as far as India is concerned, again, for the last time, I'm going to say my personal view, we have no shortage of either demography or democracy. We are well endowed on both fronts. I don't think anyone in India, any of our political commentators, the divide across the political spectrum, has ever had any doubts about the future of democracy. And I think India is a very good example of a post-colonial economy, which after 190 years of colonialism is a success story. Today, we are a $2.7 trillion economy. Our per capita income is low, but the World Bank figures I saw today, it's crossed $2,000. But by 2025, we'll be a $5 trillion economy with a doubling of the per capita income, and by 2030, a $10 trillion economy with a quadrupling of that. Do democracies cooperate enough? I think before you reach that point, Peter, we should do some serious introspection. What is at stake today is not democracy. I think I agree with Stephen Harper's thesis that democracy is the best form of government and democracy is here to stay, not only in the countries we were born in and represent, but worldwide. I think in the absence of any other form or system, democracy is what will ultimately this thing. You would define democracy differently, that's a different point. Let me just say that democracy is going through a difficult phase. And that difficult phase is because I think in a somewhat premature manner, around the early 1990s, when Fukuyama wrote his famous book, we thought that the Western liberal democratic order, as we had come to know of it, the Washington Consensus, international trade and liberalization were now, and he went so far as to say communism is dead. I think he's had a chance of revising that thesis. But the general impression is that what is happening today is a threat to democracy. Not at all. I think international trade is a great thing. It produces a lot of wealth. But I think what we overlooked was the fact that international trade, unless you're careful, also produces a great amount of inequality, and that elites are able to rig the markets to their advantage. That's the first point I make. I'm not against trade per se. In fact, I'm all for trade. But the fact is that the multilateral trading system on which international prosperity is founded and which it's anchored, today finds that the multilateral trading system looks to be in a limbo. It looks to be half dead. My young friend, Dr. Mohan Kumar, who has been a colleague of mine in the Foreign Service and who replaced me as chairman of RIS, was just giving me statistics. If you remove the goods which are traded at 0%, 80% of goods traded now go through FTAs. Now, FTAs are by definition selective. So what is the crisis in democracy that we see today? Why are right-wing governments, I mean, again, I'm very proud to be a member of the Modi cabinet. See, all those guys who thought that the Western liberal democratic order had come to stay were a little upset by the fact that there was a pendulum swing the other way around in Europe, in parts of Asia, elsewhere. And that pendulum swing took place because that was the era when social media was not available, when the angst which was felt by those who lost their jobs as a result of trade liberalization did not know how to express itself. I'm quite perplexed. If you had social media around when Fukuyama wrote his first book, Twitter, I think he may have got a slightly different perspective. Today, the issues which are confronting us are that the democracies, and I have no doubt that democracies have to cooperate more effectively, more meaningfully with each other. When I was an ambassador in, I think, Geneva, we tried to produce what was called a community of democracies. But a community of democracies, I realized later, was very strong on rhetoric, but it overlooked the fact that democracy comes from the people, from within. And then when I was in New York and I wrote my book, Perilous Intervention, if we start using force, and I mean military force, to reorder societies from the outside, then you have a problem on your hands. And I think we have not been able to come to that consequence. I list two other issues. I think we were not able to anticipate the kind of complexities that the rise of China throws up. That's a preoccupation. I was telling you, Peter, I don't think only with countries in Asia, but it's also a preoccupation, I believe, in terms of the trading system and other issues with North America, countries in North America, countries in Europe. And I think Russia. Have we fully understood what the consequences are? I mean, we were very strong in terms of our linear projection of what would happen to NATO, how it would be done. But, you know, there were safeguards built into the old system. What do we need to do? I entirely agree that there has to be a more democracy-anchored cooperation amongst nations. But I will conclude, because I don't want to get too long. I can come in later in the discussion. It is not only a question of democracies inside countries. I think there has to be a much higher democracy quotient in the international cooperation part. This book, which is the first copy, which is here. I also talk about multilateral and global governance. I think global governance today, you know, when the current international order was designed, it was post-1945, it was a Westphalian state-centered model, but it had we the peoples in the UN anchor. I think that we the peoples part is asserting itself now. But the manner in which it is asserting itself gives people the impression that democracy is at stake. I don't think so. I think what's happening is that state systems, especially in that state Westphalian model, I think we got the current international system going, whether it's the Atlantic Charter, IMF, World Bank, etc., because 3 or 4 of the bigger countries, a little bit of the, to the victor belong the spoils post-Second World War order, they could set it up. Today, if you have to design a new system, I think the system will be tenable and will endure only if the democracies assume leadership and the democracies are able to ensure that those values are it, but it will have to be done. And I think the best examples I see is when the UN started doing this top-down systems, they didn't work. When it set up the 2030 agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals, with participation from the ground upwards, it works. And I think that's what will have to be done.
Minister, thank you very much. Now I'm going to turn to you, Ms. Fallon.
Turn to me?
Yes, I'm turning to you. The minister talked about both Russia and China, countries that you work on specifically. And I wonder if you see enough fundamental cooperation in Europe, but also in Asia, addressing the challenges that both Russia and China face.
Thanks. I was listed fifth, so I was kind of just enjoying listening to people. First of all, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me, especially Samir Saran, and all of the wonderful volunteers, and the staff have just been outstanding. And I'm happy to break bread with all of you today, so thank you very much. Democracy is a thread that has been running through the last 3 days of this discussion. And I was thinking, since I was going to be at the end, I was going to try to take it from a different angle, but you asked about Russia, China. Well, there is some green shoots, because we're all thinking about how bad things are in these the authoritarian advance. The world is concerned about authoritarian advance, especially with new technology. So we're seeing in Russia some green shoots because this was part of my conclusion, so I'm just jumping ahead since you asked me a question out of order here. Let's see. Armenia, Belarus, and Russia have this, what is called innovative activism. So they're using modern techniques to help bring up the next generation. But what I'm going to try to address right now, I'm going to start with a short anecdote. I'm sorry, I lost my pace here. Every year, the Chinese embassy in Brussels has a wonderful New Year Chinese gala for the New Year. And their narrative is that we never interfere in countries' politics. And so last year in Belgium, they had a populist leader invited to speak at the embassy. And I could hear the Belgians behind me kind of grumbling about it. They weren't very happy. And so he took to the stage and he said, we must improve China-Belgian terrorism. We have to get more European-China terrorism. And then people were twittering and tittering around me, and I was like, what's going on? And finally, every time he said terrorism, people would laugh, and I looked over at the Chinese officials, and they were getting a bit nervous. And finally, the Flemish populist leader cottoned on and realized it's the year of EU-China tourism. So sometimes they might back the wrong horse, and so maybe they, by kind of giving this man a stage, a populist leader, it kind of backfired on them. So this is there have been two reports on what is described as Chinese sharp power. I'm sorry, is this microphone okay? Chinese sharp power. So we understand that. I'm going to give you from a European perspective because I know there are some Americans and North Americans on this panel as well as the Indian minister. So Europe is kind of very open, and this is kind of a symptom. We see it happening in other democracies, but since I've been doing a lot of research on this, I'm going to discuss how this sharp power can erode and weaken democracies. And this is a problem for all democracies. We've seen Australia, Taiwan, influence activities have grown dramatically. So how does this happen? We've seen, of course, the internet was the great idea. Everyone should get on the internet. It's a great leveler, but Russia and both China have learned to use it to their advantage. Alyssa Ayres wrote an excellent paper about the Quad and how democracies need to share information and work together. And that was one of the issues that she had highlighted in her paper. Recently, for example, Huawei had a tweet because Twitter's banned in China. And so they tweeted Huawei, but they had to do it on an iPhone. So that just kind of begs the question, is it blocked? Obviously, Twitter's blocked in China, but they need the iPhone to tweet to the rest of us. So Huawei can spread their information using these social platforms. So we also see success with Alliance for Securing Democracy. And I suggest that we have to improve communications because there are a lot of lessons learned, especially from these countries on the front line. So in Europe, we see that smaller countries are actually the most susceptible because they need investment, and it's kind of a whole of government approach, perhaps by the Chinese. So economic, there isn't a hotel that you can visit in Europe that doesn't have CGTN. It was formerly called CCTV, and you might not get BBC, you might not get CNN, but you'll definitely get Chinese television. So I was at a conference recently on democracy in the Czech Republic, and as soon as I got off the plane, there was a giant billboard for the Chinese bank, and then right next to it was for Xi Jinping's new book on authoritarianism. And then I went to my hotel room, turned on the TV, and it was RT doing a documentary about China's Belt and Road Initiative, and I just felt like, oh my gosh, what? It's a very different environment depending where you sit in Europe. So in certain countries, you feel the presence far more dramatically than in, say, Paris or even Brussels. So how can we deal with this? If we're an open economy and democratic countries, we allow all these types of influence activities. Russia as well. RT, some people want to have a sign on it saying, this is disinformation. So it's very, very difficult to deal with this. And then we have to wrestle with questions of freedom of speech. So how do we cope with this? China just published a new paper, a China-EU paper. Yeah.
Just move it away.
Okay, a China-EU paper on December 10th, it came out, the EU white paper, and it's kind of a white paper to tell Europe how they expect them to behave. The last one was 2004, and it has a long list of, it's like a laundry list of what you can talk about or what you shouldn't discuss. Tiananmen, Taiwan, Tibet, and also now the newest thing was fake news. So they want to cooperate with European countries on fake news. And this is kind of a interesting twist because they often complain how documentaries in Germany, for example, portray what's going on in China, and they're not very happy with that. So they want to cooperate on what they deem as fake news. So we have a lot of questions we have to deal with about who's going to choose, who's going to decide what's fake news, what's not. So we're already seeing this slippery slope in Europe. So China's influence operations in Europe serve three aims. First, Beijing attempts to build consensus among EU countries. Second, Beijing aims to exacerbate divisions among EU countries. And third, China seeks acceptance of its political system. So having this very deep pockets to perform public diplomacy is something that we should be aware of. Since our systems are open, we must allow that, but how do we educate the population? And I'm thinking back in the United States, we have a lot of populism. People are disappointed with the system. Another theme of this conference was the liberal order, what's happening with the world reorder. And a lot of people do feel, Trump is perhaps a symptom of a system where people feel left out. And even though it's a democracy, we have this group of people who really feel that the liberal order isn't meeting their needs. So how can we support the liberal order as well as addressing the needs of the public? All right. All right, I'll conclude here. I'll just conclude here. So the only thing worse than operating with partners is trying to operate without them. Thank you. Okay.
Thanks so much. And we're going to get back. Everyone's going to have a chance to re-engage. I'm going to go to Mr. Yu. And you heard a little bit about some anecdotes about the fundamental presence of China in Europe. And my sense is that European cooperation with China, American cooperation with China, business cooperation, can be frustrating to Asian countries, India perhaps, that see China as a very real challenge. And I'm just wondering, from where you sit now at the Asia Group, how real is the China challenge to Asian countries and in the neighborhood, India maybe specifically? And is the United States, as the world's most powerful democracy, at this juncture, taking the right approach to China?
Thanks, Peter. And it's a delight to be here, and I appreciate the audience over lunch to talk about these issues. So you asked kind of two questions on the Asia Pacific. One, sort of nature of the role / challenge or threat of China, and two, the U.S. response. And maybe I'll answer them in the rubric of the theme of this panel that's, as Theresa mentioned, has run throughout the conference, which is collaboration among democracies, and how to think about that. And let's offer you my views on that topic. I guess the first thing I would say is that is to express basic agreement with, I think, what many speakers have expressed regarding the sort of broad-based nature of concerns as it relates to China's behavior, the objectives that it set out for itself, the basic rubric that the current U.S. administration has set out, initially in the speech by Vice President Pence, I think is a generally reflects an emerging consensus in the United States around China's behavior, whether it's in the strategic sphere, in the question around rules-based order, questions around the nature of economic relationships. I I think if you look at the United States policy discussions, I think there's an emerging consensus on that. There are differences, I would say, around what to do about it. But in terms of the challenge that China presents, I think it's generally accurate, and that you've seen that expressed by American and other speakers over the last two days or so. On the question of how to respond, let me say that for those of you who heard the last set of panelists in the other audience, I think I'm going to pick up on a number of those themes because I think they're very true and try to pull them together. One, I agree with the premise that democracy is the best model, but I also believe that there's a competition underway. I think it's unquestionable that in the minds of at least some in this region, if not around the world, there's a question of choice around which model is best suited for countries and peoples in those countries. And I think we have to recognize that basic truth. There's no comparison to the kind of competition in the 20th century. The dynamics of it are very different today, but it exists. And so I think that does put a series of questions to democracies in terms of collaboration. But I also think we have to recognize that banding together, if you will, to put it sort of crudely, among sort of the most like-minded democracies can be exclusionary. And I think we have to recognize that downside. So, if you look historically, post-World War II era and beyond, I think it's, unquestionably a historical fact that there's strategic collaboration among democracies. Whether it's in the creation of institutions and policies, in military deployments, that's happened. In my, in the more recent past, when I served in government, it's unquestionable across the policy spectrum that there was a collaboration among democracies. And so I think you see it today, the discussions around what does the Quad mean? What is the implication of the Quad? I think that's a reflection of a fact that you find at least those four countries, and then bilaterally from an American perspective with each of those countries, a high degree of alignment around interests. So I think that's sort of the first element of the U.S. response. But I do think that there are, and we have to recognize that there are limitations to this notion that democracies come together and share objectives 100%. I also believe that that's not the case. I think that the political systems create a predisposition for interests and objectives that align between democracies and among democracies, but there are very clear exceptions to this. I think the first one historically would be the U.S.-India relationship. Up until about 15 years or so ago, there was not strategic alignment between the United States and India. It was more strategic difference, strategic distance. That's changed significantly, and I think it's one of the most important developments in this region. Democracies have disputes over strategy and policy, whether it's the use of force, trade disputes. There are clearly exceptions where, despite the similarities that we share, views of national interest and objectives differ among democracies. And I think we have to recognize that there are some limitations here that exist and that we have to not assume complete alignment, and we always have to work at it. I think that's a reality of anyone who serves in government. Democracies change over time. The minister made the point around they're a reflection of society. It's messy. But I think that also creates a resilience in when democracies work together, because there are the connections between the officials in government and our societies. Part of at least in my view, some of the challenges that democracies face today, certainly in our country, I think, stem from an erosion over time of an appreciation by our peoples for the policies, the strategies, the military deployments, the economic initiatives that we pursue overseas in the global system.
Is it the pursuit or the failure to explain properly?
Well, I think it's you put it more, you put it how I want to say it. It's the failure to engage and explain domestically. In fact, yesterday on one of the panels, several speakers mentioned the recent elections we had and the change of power in the House. And I was at the reception for a new House member who very pointedly, I served with her in the Obama administration. She went on to win her seat. And she said to the assembled audience, many of whom were former or current national security officials in government, she looked at all of us and said, "You don't find support among Americans by talking policy to Americans. You explain our objectives through stories and impact on why the UN is important or why we should have deployments in Japan." And we haven't done enough of that. And I think in our country, that is producing challenges that we see play out through some of these elections, in some of our elections. The last point I would make is, as I think about democratic collaboration, certainly in the Asia-Pacific region, there's political strategy that we look to have alignment on. There's military operations, military exercises, the planning. We listened to the assembled chairman yesterday. But I think a critical dimension to this, which I don't think has gotten enough attention, at least this year's dialogue, has been the economic dimension of strategic cooperation. And there are a series of challenges there that we all face with the changing dynamic of our economies, with the introduction of artificial intelligence and the technological changes that are putting pressures on each of our societies that we all have to grapple with. But then collectively, I would say and submit that the Trans-Pacific Partnership was a key manifestation of that collaboration, which suffered a setback, frankly, when the United States under the current administration chose to withdraw. But we need to focus on that aspect of strategic cooperation as much as any other. So I'll stop there, Peter.
Thank you so much. We have a panelist who we recruited 5 minutes before the panel began. And so I'm going to ask Shuv Majumdar just if he has anything to add at this juncture from the Canadian perspective.
Well, I appreciate that, Peter, being voluntold to participate in a way that replaces Stephen Harper. I feel like I'm diminishing a lot of people because he's fairly irreplaceable. But I thank you, and I thank the audience here for welcoming somebody on such short notice. In addition to succeeding Peter as policy director to various Canadian foreign ministers during the Harper government, I spent 5 years leading the International Republican Institute in Iraq and Afghanistan between 2005 and 10. So I bring a perspective on democracy and its organization that spans about 15 years of experience in this realm. It was interesting that we're sharing a stage with General Petraeus. His counterinsurgency manual often read like a democracy promotion manual, and how the effort to ally at a very local level with democratic actors required local license and enfranchisement of the idea of the citizen, of an individual. I start with this comment because when we talk about cooperation amongst democracies, we're also talking about cooperation between Democrats, people who are identified as free-thinking individuals in their societies. The order that we are now looking at reordering is a question, I think, that is provoked because the institutions that were formed to govern this idea of our values, our shared values around the individual, was born originally in 1945 in the ashes of World War and in a period of post-colonial change. The world is very different today, and the great rivalry and competition that shaped those initial conversations to avert all war for all time has been characterized by the collapse of the Soviet Empire. In that time, we've seen technology and the rise of China with a counter model emerge. But the Chinese model is not one of communist reflection. It is state corporations and control, a blending between economic and political and military interest governed by a political party. What I think is interesting about this conversation is how the institutions of the West of the last 50 years now need to transform to these new realities. And whether it is a dialogue on cooperation between security that were characterized by NATO primarily over the last 50 years, or by prosperity, which were the ad hoc conversations around the tables of the G8 and G20, or our values, which were originally the United Nations. Cooperation between democratic countries and dialogue between democratic countries are going to take on a whole new characteristic. And that is exciting in some ways, because on one side, across Asia, Europe, and North America, we are seeing new partners emerge, just like we are here in India, where as a result, direct consequence of the administration of Narendra Modi of the last 2 years, we're seeing a more pragmatic India resolve to engage the world and address the realities of a rising giant on its borders, acting on behalf of its people, formalizing the economy, but of course starting this type of change from the acknowledgement of the individual, their entrepreneurship, their skills, all the way up through the banking system, the formalization of their economy, and the kind of things that this country needs to do. So, in short, commenting a little bit about the question of populism, which I think Prime Minister Harper has written very eloquently about in his book. A lot of what we see today as described as populism usually has the admonishment of the global elite as a perspective that is ill-informed or uneducated. I think what is true about the Prime Minister's thesis is that at the end of the day, grievances have emerged as a consequence of massive technological and economic transformation. These grievances ought not to be diminished, but treated with respect and responded to with pragmatic, practical solutions that make and respond to the quality of life questions that are to come. It is easy to characterize in places like the United States and elsewhere that those grievances are as a result of immigration, but that's short-sighted. It's also technological adaptation, robotics. I think General Petraeus had mentioned this on a panel yesterday. The future of work, the way in which lives are lived, are going to be transforming dramatically both in the West and in the East simultaneously. And the borders that used to be very difficult to transcend 50 years ago are now so much easier to peer through. And so expectations around quality of life will also be very different. And so when we look at these populist movements, yes, they'll be characterized by anger from time to time, but they'll also be testing the institutions in which they're going to be thriving. So in the United States, I have a great deal of faith in the U.S. Constitution. The institutions are strong and are capable of adjusting to the pressures of localized grievance. In emerging democracies where institutions are weaker, that's where I think there's greater concern about autocratic forces and more cooperation is necessary.
Thanks very much, Shuv, and thank you again for joining the panel at short notice. General Petraeus, rather than asking you a specific question, I just ask if you want to round out what you've heard so far and add your insights.
You bet. Thanks, first of all, Peter, for the kind introduction. Thanks for the privilege of being with this particular panel. Thanks for your mention of Senator McCain, for whom I also have reverence. He was literally the most principled member of Congress with whom I had the privilege of engaging, and perhaps most significant in that was his absolutely steadfast support for democracy around the world and for human rights and values and so forth that I think most, if not all, in this room and in the U.S. and in India also share strong beliefs. I should note up front that I am very much with Winston Churchill on both democracy and on America, and I note that realizing that he was a huge proponent of colonialism during his time as prime minister, especially when it came to the jewel in the crown. But he said famously that democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. He also noted that you can always count on America to do the right thing after trying all the other things. And I think we're proving that again right now in the United States. Look, I think up front, any nation's foreign policy is always a result of a degree of a tug of war and intellectual wrangling between values and interests, interests being these just sort of hard realities, and values, of course, again, associated with democracy, free market economics, human rights, and so on. And I think nothing illustrates that better than the contemporary case of how the United States, the White House, Congress, the American people, and so forth, deal with the horrific incident of the Khashoggi murder. Again, I am a firm believer in the freedoms, again, that we, I think, all here hold dear: speech, religion, press, assembly. And I like to believe that we were fighting in these various combat endeavors, at least in part, in defense of those. And I noted that even when criticism of the policies we were implementing turned to criticism personally, and noted how proud I was that we had a country in which that could be done, not with entire sincerity, but it was a good response to a full-page ad in the New York Times, as some of you may recall, attacking me personally. But it is a feature of our democracy, and one which I do take a good degree of pride in. I am a believer in the so-called rules-based international order and the institutions that comprise it, although I absolutely note, as several of the panelists have, and I very much agree with what the others have said before me, that there is a need to accommodate what I think are truly legitimate desires of countries like China, like India, and others that have risen since the end of World War II, when indeed those institutions were largely established, and some of the aspects of them seemed to be set in stone. I think that's particularly important at a time in the world where you do see a trend towards authoritarianism. I think that is one of the distinguishing features of the last decade or half-decade in the world. It's accelerated, I think, in the last year or two. You see populism, you see ultranationalism, you do see these grievances, as Shuv, I think, correctly identified, an awareness of wealth inequality in my own country, a sense by a fairly sizable part of the population that the so-called American dream is no longer within their grasp, that their children may not do better than they did, which is always the historic achievement of the United States. And I do think that, as others have mentioned, that this is a time, all of this takes place at a time when there is a true, what might be termed a return of history, a play on, obviously, the article by Francis Fukuyama in 1989, and then the book in 1991, where he talked about, in history, of course, as he defined it, was the competition between different political and economic ideas, the competition between the U.S.-led Western democratic systems of governance and free market economics in various forms, to be sure, and that of the Soviet-led world and a communist party dictatorship and a command economy. And of course, he famously predicted that that would collapse of its own weight, and within 6 months it did, proving quite prophetic. I actually have a project now as a fellow up at Harvard on a part-time basis that is titled The Return of History, and it looks at what has happened, what brought this about. And I think that it is very important to acknowledge this, that what China has achieved is truly unprecedented in world history. I think I mentioned yesterday, for those who heard it, that you should go to the National Museum in China and see the depiction of this 40-year period of extraordinary, mind-blowing progress since Deng Xiaoping welcomed the world to China, again, some 40 years ago. And that is a different system. And so there is a new competition. It is between the democracies and free market economic countries of the world, most of which, the major ones of which, are under some degree of strain and pressure. If you look at the 5 major countries of Europe, for example, the UK with Brexit, Spain with a minority government, Italy with a right-wing, left-wing government that only agrees on one issue, which is no more refugees, France, which we thought was the defying all of the odds and so forth, but with now, we tended to forget that Marine Le Pen's party got 35 or some odd percent of the vote, and of course the yellow vests are now causing significant issues there. And then Germany, where a chancellor who should have been guaranteed chancellorship for life, given the way the country has performed, albeit with some credit to Gerhard Schroeder for his reforms, instead barely could put together a coalition to continue in her position, and ultimately had to give up control of her party, albeit to a confederate of hers. Now, and in the United States, where I think populism was a major factor in the election of Donald Trump. So all of this, the democracies of the world, certainly some where that is not a feature. It's perhaps less a feature here, although I'm not quite so sure, given the results in the 3 state elections recently. And then you contrast that, again, where you have China with a meritocratic one-party system and a hyper-competitive market economy, albeit one that is within the construct that includes very substantial state-owned organizations, enterprises, and also, obviously, considerable government activity in the economy. But this is a serious competition, and we should recognize, obviously, that there are freedoms that are not cherished behind the Great Firewall of China, and that there are a variety of legitimate concerns that have been the basis for the actions by a U.S. president who is willing to take the kind of firm stand against some of these various issues. By the way, as I mentioned yesterday, and I think this can be described as a new Cold War, I think that's the only conclusion of reading carefully the Vice President's speech in Washington and then also in the APEC summit. It's not one that I celebrate. It's not one that I see one to break into open war. I'd like to see a mutually beneficial relationship. I'd like to see the various issues resolved, issues that we knew were in place during the previous U.S. government, and where over time we finally concluded that the promises and initiatives were not actually bearing out when it came to issues like the theft of intellectual property, like non-tariff trade barriers, and a variety of other, the South and East China Sea, and so forth and so on. So this is very much a moment, I think, of enormous importance for democracies, for those, again, who I think, as in this room, share belief in the various freedoms and values that we have all highlighted. And it's a time when, therefore, democracies of the world should be working more closely together, should be linking arms and taking firmer stances, not provocative stances, again, not out to provoke some kind of activity or response, but certainly to show again, that there are limits and that we do indeed still cherish these very unique aspects of our forms of governance and economics to the point that we are willing to take a stand on that. That is tough at a time when the world's democracies are experiencing these various issues, as I mentioned, of populism and ultranationalism and so forth. And are challenged. I think it's correct to note that global trade has had losers as well as winners, something that the political leaders didn't always acknowledge quite as fulsomely as perhaps they should have, nor did the resulting policies perhaps do all that they should have for those who ended up on the losing side of these particular arrangements. So it's a critical time, I think, for democracies. And I think democracies not only each individually have to get their own houses in order, I think they have to work together more effectively because of the pressures of the current challenges that exist, and because there are lots of governments out there that are teetering, really leaders that are teetering one way or the other, and look to the West and see what they see there, and look to the East and see extraordinary accomplishments, which we should absolutely recognize and applaud, but without, again, some of the features that all of us, I think, believe are essential to the systems essential to the existence of individuals in a governed state. Thanks.
General Petraeus, thank you so much. I'm going to go back to the minister. And based on what you've heard now, if you could just get your reaction to both what you've heard. General Petraeus concluded by saying that democracies should be working more closely together. I guess if you could address how, and maybe specifically talk a little bit about the context of the American-Indian relationship as well.
Well, that's the easier part of the discussion, the America-India, because I think this is a trajectory which is doing well on all fronts, which is not to say that there aren't issues like trade policy and other perception issues, how we cooperate in Afghanistan, how much of leeway do you give to the Taliban, but that's the kind of comfort zone that I think democracies operate within. And I think there is, in India, and I can speak about that a little more confidently, there is no element of contention between political parties. I mean, the extreme Communist Party of India, Marxist, etc., which is like a global phenomena, it's less relevant. But I think India also is becoming more confident in being able to engage the United States. And I think that's the important thing. And I think that as I think when we are a $5 trillion economy or a $10 trillion economy by 2030, that'll be a much more, it'll be easier thing. But I have one concern, which is when we talk about trade issues, when we talk about other security issues, I think all of us are dealing with the challenges faced by, on account of a rising China somewhat differently. I mean, all of us, whether you're a democracy or you're not a democracy, your ultimate guiding coordinates will be national interest. I mean, President Trump wants a good trade deal, so do the Canadians, and the Canadians get caught in the crossfire sometime on specific issues, and so do we. I mean, I have two areas of concern. One is either you are anchored in the system or rule of law as established internationally, that you accept the verdicts of international tribunals, etc. I'm not going into any specifics, and that you accept the basic disciplines established by the multilateral trading system. Now, I have a problem with China, which is not China specific. Any country, if I find that my trade deficit is constantly on the increase, because at the end of the day, I am not sure that the system which is being followed elsewhere, whether that you are able to determine where the state level dumping stops and the, where the state subsidies stop or the enterprise sale below normal value dumping start. That kind of transparency, that's what you're looking for. And I think we need to engage them. I think bilaterally we're trying to do that with the Chinese. I think they've acknowledged the fact that there has to be something systemic there, because you cannot have a large number of countries persistently running these trade deficits. Similarly, on the security issue, I think you should be very clear that this is a new ball game, that the equations which have existed for a large part of the post-war period are being changed. I personally believe that the Chinese are slowly but surely revising the international system of cooperation. How much the others will acquiesce in that change taking place. The easier part of the agreement is we democracies must cooperate with each other. That's easier. Now, how do you do it? And that is where I think you need to take this from the think tank, conceptual, cerebral level to defining this on the ground through pragmatic measures, etc. I'm very happy to engage the Canadians, but then I find that they are completely, at some points of time in history, completely insensitive to something that I regard as, questioning my fundamentals as a country. You give free play to groups who, by any international yardstick. I used to say that in London. When they used to, I used to tell them when I was Deputy High Commissioner there, I said, you guys are allowing some of these characters to take advantage of the democratic freedoms you give. Now, if somebody is openly espousing secessionism, believes in not playing footsie with terrorism, but is almost part of that, you don't need to get radicalized by any particular. It's happening. I mean, there is a process underway. Democracies must learn to cooperate in order to safeguard their most sacred and fundamental institution. And I think that's a very good starting point. Then after that, you have to cooperate at the international level, but that cooperation has to be within the confines of national interest.
Minister, thank you very much. And Shuv might want an opportunity to talk about Canada's new government. And we're now going to go to questions. We're going to take all questions and then at the same time, and then we will we'll take answers. So if you could identify yourself and then maybe one sentence to introduce your question, and then the question, and that way we can try to get everybody's question in. And I'm just going to go around and scan for hands, and use the microphone. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm Sophie Boisseau from Center for Asian Studies at IFRI Paris. It's not a question, it's just a concern. I think we have to revisit core values of democracy. And I take, the purpose of General Petraeus. There is a variety of legitimate concern concerning a functional democracy. We are not always functional, but it does not impede us to to stick to our core values. I think we have to revisit these core values and to explain the extraordinary trajectories of these core values through centuries in order to convince them and not to impose, a dysfunctional democracy above other. Thank you.
Thank you. Scanning, yeah.
I apologize because mine will be more remark, but I'll have a question as well. Since Theresa mentioned European points of view, and I come from Slovakia, but based in Prague, there was a comment about Prague, and I want to clarify because this is exactly, I think, the oversimplification of China's influence when we walk through the airports and hotels, and we don't really spend enough time and interact with the expert community or the public to know what the reality is. For me, growing up in Czechoslovakia, where we had no access to information sometimes, having books from any country on the shelf is plus, because we move forward. We have freedom of information now. It's up to the public to decide what they read. I know many people who heard about the book of Xi Jinping. I got 2 copies, even when the president visited. Many people don't read the book. So the fact that it's available, I think it's practicing our freedoms of information. Those books at the airport are probably for the Chinese tourists who arrive to Prague and for the Chinese government to make some sort of a statement that the presence is there. In terms of our information services, there are reports online about China and Russia threat interference with our systems available in Czech and English language online. It's a free open source. We talk about this. We also talk about how much Chinese investments are much lower than Japanese and Korean. It's a tragedy of these embassies that they don't have strong enough public diplomacy to actually promote it. So they overshadow the Chinese promotion. And another point about democracy, you see, going through that transformation all my life, we look to the United States as our role model. And I appreciate General's comment that we have to clean up our own houses in order to actually be those role models maybe and have those discussions, because it was not Central Eastern Europe that had rise in sales of books by Orwell, 1984, or Snyder's On Tyranny after the election of Trump, because it was that population in the West that was concerned about the freedoms and what dangers, because Czechoslovakia went through the Russian military invasion. It's very clear to us how much that influence still is present in our societies. We don't want that, but we need partners who also practice democracy the way they asked us to practice, and then we can have that discussion. So my question is, how can we overcome this oversimplification? Because unless people come to our regions, spend time, interact with us, we will never have a decent and, I guess, discussion that brings some results.
Can I just do it?
Thomas, we're gonna just keep going, but yeah, I got it. Yeah, yep.
McGill University. I think nobody mentioned income inequality as the fundamental problem democracy is facing.
I mentioned it.
Yes,
I
you
didn't
did, but
highlight it.
not
It's
seriously.
in the context
The,
of trade.
the reason that in the past, liberal states faced crises. They came up with solutions. First, after World War II, you had the Roosevelt's idea of the welfare state. GIs were inducted. Johnson's idea of great society. A whole host of measures were taken by the liberals to address these problems. Today, the liberals are not doing it. And until and unless they do it, and education is becoming impossible for the American lower middle class, $70,000 to go to any small college now. And this is going to worsen the situation. Until you find solutions to that problem, liberalism is under challenge.
Thank you.
I'm Ofra Benja of Tel Aviv University, and there is now a new term floating in the world, namely illiberal democracy. My question to you, is there really a possibility to divorce liberalism from democracy and democracy from liberalism? You are using it in Turkey, for example, and how are you going to cooperate with such illiberal democracies? And the other question, very short one, can you, this is to General Petraeus, can you implant democracy in other society, and how do you reassess the experiment in Iraq?
Short
Thank you.
question. We're just gonna keep, yeah.
Yeah, Chitra Subramaniam, I'm an editorial advisor to the Republic. I have an interest in trade and international relations. Madame Fallon, China is already influencing EU policy through Greece. You can see it in human rights. I mean, every treaty in Geneva where I live partly is watered down. So that oversimplification is just, it's a different situation. The bigger question I have is the leadership in Europe. I mean, it was said that the ghosts of the Second World War have been buried. I'm not sure, because I watched Mr. Putin's 90-minute marathon press conference 2 weeks ago, 1,500 journalists from around the world. And there was no leader standing up in Europe responding. Followed, and then just before that, Monsieur Macron had spoken about the ghosts of the World War coming back, and there's talk of war, and people are talking about war, there's fear. What is going wrong?
Thank you.
You want? Yeah, I would like to
Identify yourself.
make a few remarks on the question.
We really don't have time for remarks. I'm really
No.
just,
Very short remarks.
Please, thank you. Yeah.
Democracy is in a competition with authoritarian systems, for sure. If we want to win this competition, we will have to be aware not only of the strength of democracy, but also of the weaknesses of the system. And the weaknesses I see is the long-term perspective is not here as much, the clearness of decision, and the quickness of decisions. And therefore, if we want to win, we have to improve in those relations. And this means also that we have to reform our systems that are now more or less 100, 150 years old. My question is now, if we want to talk not only about national questions and national interests, but as General Petraeus said, it is a question of the future world order. And this means that, of course, democratic systems will have to cooperate more than authoritarian. One, because they need just to find a decision, to compromise, to prepare it, and so on. So what can we do in order to get all the democracies in America, in Europe, in Asia, in a line to make a clear plan for the future world order? How can we try not just to stand on the national position, to resist at the national position, but how can we do it for a world order? This will be the question. Otherwise, there always will be two systems.
Thank you. Everyone just gets, I'm afraid, just one sentence, because I'm a one-sentence question or a one-sentence comment, just because we have to wrap up. But I do want to get everybody's voice.
Okay, thank you. I might take 30 seconds more than that, but slow, so. Well, my name is Vijay Lakshmi. I teach at the JNU. The question is, I've listened to all of the comments, and the question is, unless people of each of these nations that we're discussing, both in democracies and the other type of governments, they have confidence in democratic values, I don't see governmental talks and efforts yielding much. And I think two things are very clear. One is when educational centers, if you see the last week's New York Times, you'll see Beijing has resisted all kinds of American centers to be opened. So therefore, how would we also bring people who resist collaboration of people to people, of cultural centers opening in each other's countries? How do we punish, or punish is the wrong word, how do we bring those countries who don't believe in these democratic values? And I think the third part of this problem is Europe itself. And this goes to Madam Fallon's argument that Europe today, yesterday I was with the European delegation, and they said there is an internal questioning of following the values, for example, freedom versus security. So maybe you can respond to that. Thank you.
Okay, really everybody gets a sentence, and then
Yeah.
we're going to have to,
My name is Komodo Vasan. I look after the Chennai Center for China Studies. General Petraeus brought out very relevant points about the democratic values and how we need to work together. China has got away on many occasions. They seem to brand everything as something with Chinese characteristics. So including democracy, which is also with Chinese characteristics. So that is the challenge that there is, because when you look at the kind of treatment that's being meted out to minorities in Tibet, and the recent treatment of Uyghurs, where the entire culture is going to be subsumed by the Han culture, what is the rest of the world doing about it? What is the democratic world doing about it? We seem to be accepting this as an internal issue, and we're not being able to put any pressure.
Thank you. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, just to pick up on this economic perspective question. So the G20 Eminent Persons Report that came out in October last year discussed the demise of Bretton Woods institutions. So the global financial safety net, the IMF, is now only 33% of total global resources. The World Bank is becoming quite marginal in terms of assistance spending. So how could a reform of these institutions help with the diffusion of liberal democratic values?
Yeah. Thank you. This is a different type of session, I think, because it's as informative as it is constructive in nature, and that's why I think it's very important to get everybody's comments and questions. I have to now just let everybody respond, and we're going to do it. I know you're eager, Mrs. Fallon, but just let me finish my sentence, please. We're going to do it in the same order that we began with Mrs. Fallon, Mr. Yu, Mr. Majumdar, General Petraeus, and we'll end with the minister. But if we could keep it very brief, please, because I'm going to be fired.
I have to, there's a paper I wrote for this conference, and I really do have to protect my reputation, because if you just slander me like that, I find that really offensive. So in the paper, there are links to research papers on this and articles I have written. So I told an anecdote because it's lunch, and I'm sorry if you were somehow offended by an anecdote, but my paper, which is on the Raisina website, it's called When the China Dream and the European Dream Collide. There are links to academic papers. IFRI, Francois Gaudiman wrote an excellent paper, and I think this is symbolic because Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary, these are countries that the EU is very concerned about, and I think your comments reflect that. You said that, to pick up on your comment about there is almost a civil war going on. I mean, if we want to use hyperbole, but I mean, Central and Eastern Europe has shallow roots in democracy. China is there, Russia is there. Zeman has both Russian influence and Chinese influence, and he's connecting the two. So it's very worrying. And I know you had been an advisor at one point, you told me, to Zeman. So, I was never advisor to Zeman. Okay, so you're with an international think tank. Okay, I don't know why you're so hostile to me. So anyway, I just recommend that you read the paper, and we're having a conference in Brussels, March 7th, about Chinese influence activities in Europe. So I invite you to join us in Brussels to attend. And maybe you can share your research on it as well. Just a couple of quick points. Our Chinese friend has left, but inter-party democracy, I mean, the Chinese were trying to promote that. Now Xi Jinping has even gotten rid of that. And just to pick up on General Petraeus' point, he said that he was recently in Beijing, but I want to point out that, like, when the commissar vanishes in the Soviet period, where people would be painted out of the picture, that's what's happening right now in Beijing. For example, Deng Xiaoping, it's his 40th anniversary, but you know who's disappearing? It's Deng Xiaoping, and he's being replaced by Xi's father. So in several paintings, Deng is gone and Xi's dad is there.
It's actually been reversed in a number of places.
Is that right? Okay. So I just saw the photos from the original opening of it. And just to throw out, okay, and then you're right. Czech Republic, Hungary wrote a separate statement. Europe is always about rule of law, and you know they use all this stuff, multilateralism. But when it really comes down to it, what is happening? For example, with the arbitral tribunal decision, July 13th, 2016, where was Europe? Okay. China had successfully blocked them, so they came up with a watered-down, toothless statement, and I think that was a kind of a warning sign. 2016, you could really see things going south. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Fallon. Mr. Yu.
I think I'll just make 4 quick points to try to pick up on some of the questions and then a couple closing thoughts. First point I would make is a question around the liberal democracy. My personal view is I don't think that will succeed, but I think as a general matter in the international system, it's an open question. I think we all probably share on this panel the same view that will eventually fail. That it's not compatible. But I think the debate is not closed now. Certainly in a number of countries in the Asia Pacific and around the world. So that's the first point. Second point, global economic structures. All I would offer on that is I anticipate as we look at the coming several decades, this will be an arena for great strategic competition in terms of what does the next iteration of these institutions look like. I don't have an answer to it. It's an open question right now, and the Chinese are putting forth their own alternatives, and I think it is a fundamental aspect of this competition between models. Third point I would make, at a minimum from an American perspective, I'm fundamentally of the view that democracy is more than one person. I think that our election last November demonstrated a level of resilience of our democracy. Our system has course correction built into it every 2 and 4 years, and I think you will see that. Question is whether that time frame is too slow for the challenges that we face in the world, and I don't have an answer to that. Last point I would make, this competition that we face in models is about the strategic orientation not of like-minded democracies, and it's probably not the orientation of China. It's all those countries in the middle. and this is what I meant by, in my opening remarks, we have to be careful when we talk about sort of the like-mindedness and cooperation among democracies to not be exclusionary. In the Asia-Pacific region, this is a question about Indonesia and Vietnam and Malaysia, countries that don't share all of our perspectives, but certainly share more with us than they do with China. And that is the space that we have shown a clear ability working with others to be very effective. But that has fallen back a little bit, and that's what we can't lose our eye on. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you so much, Mr. Majumdar.
I note that my friend Hardeep is very excited for me to respond to the idea of Khalistan. So let me not respond to it specifically, but take his point, because I think it is actually about what many people here are talking about. Mob rule is not democracy. Exactly. Democracy is an ordering of liberty, and it is adapted to different cultures in different places and evolves over time from the time of Cyrus the Great through the Magna Carta to the US Declaration of Independence, the French Declaration of the Rights of Man. So we're looking at a story that is old about the tension between freedom and tyranny. That is a story that adapts over the ages, and over the last 50 years, much of that story has been described between the tension of Soviet Empire and a West that inherited a peace and did the best they could to fashion the world to come. So now we are upon a new age in which fake news, foreign policy, free speech, all intersect to abuse the idea of individual freedom and liberty. And that is where you see violent extremist ideologies be able to virulently spread across free societies, recruit individuals to brutal causes, and commit horrible crimes. It is ultimately a battle of ideas that is ordering the world and has ordered the world for thousands of years. And more so acutely today, those ideas can transcend borders and language in ways that have never been known before in human history. I think that's exciting. Let me bring that perspective to the table, that this moment in which the ideas of choice and competition are actually ones that can unleash and unlock populations being restrained by the apparatus of their states. And so countries that are inherently more open, more democratic, more institutionally entrenched to deal with the pressures of deep debate and pluralistic debate in their countries are ones that will prosper and thrive nobly. Countries that are struggling with how those institutions will capture that debate are at a decision point about how they intend to govern the aspirations and fears of the masses. And countries that try and control thought and conform society around the conspiracies or the ambitions of one particular party or individual are ultimately standing in the way of the aspirations of their people. And so while autocracy is on the rise, the gangsters that try and run the lives of the individuals they control are not that big in number. And the people that are trying to find a way to have a prosperous and peaceful life are now getting access to the information that may not have been accessible to them decades ago. So I'll stop at that, but I do believe that one comment is kind of a point in which I'd like to conclude on. Whether it is the institutions of security, of prosperity, or of our values, a reordering of the world does need to happen, and it needs to happen on the basis of our shared values.
Thanks very much. General Petraeus.
Well, let me start just actually by saying bravo to Shuv's and quite inspirational message, frankly. I just hope it proves to be true in the competition that features now in the return of history. I'd say d'accord to the point of revisiting, revalidating, refining, rethinking whatever the principles, the big ideas, the core values, and so forth of democracy and free market economics, because I think if many have made the point, this has been found lacking by some of the citizens of our democracies. I do believe we have to compete in the marketplace of ideas. I think we should welcome it. Again, we believe in our ideas. We should be quietly confident in the importance of, again, democratic values and human rights and freedoms and so forth. But we should recognize that you do have to compete, and you just can't assert something. You have to be persuasive. You have to then demonstrate at the end of the day why that should be persuasive. I share the concerns over, again, inequality, not just, again, in wealth distribution, but in access to sufficient education. As the point was made, arguably a third to maybe as much of a half of the United States children do not have access to the same education that all should indeed have access to. There's been a deterioration of it in some parts of our country. The same is true with basic health services. Rule of law in some respects, even just basic opportunity. And I mean, that's, again, as I harken back to the earlier idea that the American dream does not appear as accessible to all Americans as it used to be, and that is a problem. I think the term illiberal democracy is a correct term. I think it's a feature, it's being demonstrated in Turkey, as mentioned, also arguably in Hungary, perhaps Egypt, certainly the Philippines, Nicaragua, maybe Brazil now, we'll see. But again, I think this is a worrisome dynamic because we should remember that democracy can actually not only bring you thoughtful, pragmatic, inspirational leaders, it can also bring you Hamas. And we should never forget that our insistence on democratic elections in Gaza resulted in that being the last democratic election that they have had because an illiberal, highly illiberal entity came to power there, reminding us of the wisdom of Bernard Lewis's famous quote that democracy in the Middle East is strong medicine. It should be taken small doses at a time. And I only mention that because I do think it does remind us that not every aspect of democracy as we might understand it in our own countries is applicable in others. In fact, I used to say in Iraq that what we wanted was government that was representative of all the people and responsive to all of the people within the means available, while guaranteeing minority rights as well as ensuring majority rule. Now, however you get to that, if it's a tribal form, I'm okay with that. Again, I wasn't the judge of this, but I did have some views. And since I was the sheikh of the strongest tribe in some countries at various times, it wasn't without some meaning. How do we assess the experiment in Iraq? Look, there were colossal mistakes made along the way in Iraq. Some people will argue that the biggest was the original decision. But I would then point to the current government in Iraq, which is a result of a fairly free and open democratic election that installed Dr. Barham Saleh, a brilliant individual. He's very pragmatic. He has a great relationship not just with me and Americans, but also with Haji Qasem Soleimani of the Quds Force. You know, welcome to the land of the two rivers. This is reality. Iraq is always going to be a neighbor of Iran, which is vastly larger, a co-religionist in its majority, and is going to have to coexist and again, have some form of constructive relationship without allowing Iran to Lebanonize Iraq as Iran would like to. In other words, by establishing very strong militias on the street that are, whose power is amplified by very strong voting numbers in the parliament. And again, the Prime Minister, Adel Abdel Mahdi, I think is also a very, very admirable figure. I do share the view, again, this is a bit of a repetition, that some democracies have not responded sufficiently decisively to address the grievances that a number of us have recognized as having emerged. You know, what will it take? At the end of the day, it always takes leaders with vision, with determination, with political skill, with pragmatism, with communication capabilities and all the rest of that. And my hope is that in those countries where there is this kind of stress that we're concerned about, that will indeed be what emerges because of the strengths, again, of democracy. What is the world doing about basic human rights and violations in China and a variety of other countries? Obviously, the answer to that, I think in this forum, everyone would agree is not enough. And again, figuring out how to do that, how to get the right mix of that relative to still dealing realistically with the world as you have it is always the challenge, and one that Senator McCain, I think, wrestled with and the IRI wrestled with, since it was essentially his organization. But he was the chairman of it, I think, when you were in Iraq. It was always the challenge that he and I discussed. Again, ideals do have to confront reality. And then finally, I think the question of the day is, how do you reform the Bretton Woods institutions? And I think the answer is more expeditiously than we have in the past. I think if we had allowed China greater voting rights in the IMF when they should have been given those by the U.S. Congress, which was the controlling legal entity at the time, we wouldn't have had the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. We wouldn't have had some of the other grievances that have been legitimate. Again, I should end by noting that I'm not one who wants to see some new Cold War. I'd like to see constructive relationships. I'd like to see us recognize the extraordinary achievements of China, while also then ensuring that China recognizes the enormous issues that we have and where there are fundamental differences between our two countries, and indeed between the countries of the free market democratic governments of the world, and indeed the system that has led China to the achievements that they have had. Thanks.
General Petraeus, thank you so much, and I want to thank all of our panelists. I'm going to run right up, of course, to the because I'm moderating on the stage next, and I know that if they'll still allow me to do that, but I do want to give the minister the last word, and then as soon as he really will get the last word, so this is the last you'll hear from me. When he's finished, I'm going to get up. Minister.
Thank you very much. No, a few rapid-fire comments. First, democracy will succeed, liberal or illiberal. The liberal or illiberal fight is going to take place inside the countries. And I have no doubt that given the ground reality today, social media, it's the liberal part which will win. There will be some tension, there will be some blood on the floor, but at the end of the day, liberal democracy is what is slated to win. The contours of international cooperation, the institutions are under strain. They are being tested as never before. I have absolutely no doubt in my mind, I'm speaking as an individual, not as a member of the Council of Ministers, the Chinese are slowly but surely creating the contours of a new international cooperative order. And I think I respect them for trying to do this. Maybe it's in their best interest. But remember, whether it's Bretton Woods institutions or the post-war, the UN, IMF, World Bank, then GATT, those institutions were created in 1945 because there was a crisis, there was a war going on, and you were able at San Francisco to get agreement. In a period of relative peace, even with talk of war, it's going to take a long time to revise institutions. But meanwhile, that thing will go on. I have absolutely no doubt that the democracies have to stand up for what somebody described as core values, but you have to do it not by ganging up against someone who doesn't believe in those core values, but by engaging them and slowly take advantage and leverage the fact that those core values in liberal democracies is what is going to appeal to people all over the world. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.